My name is Avery Chambers, and I'm 28 years old. There are moments that split your life into a clean before and after, and you don't realize it's happening until you're already standing in the wreckage, blinking at the quiet. For me, it happened at a holiday table under my mother's chandelier. Light glittering off crystal glasses. A turkey glazed so perfectly it looked staged for a magazine shoot. The skin was golden and tight, herbs shining like jewelry. My mother could make anything look effortless when she wanted witnesses. That should have been my first warning. Because this dinner wasn't for warmth. It wasn't for peace. It was for control. I knew something was wrong the second my mother smiled at me from across the table. It wasn't the polite, performative smile she wore for holiday photos or country club brunches, the one that said, "Look at us. Look at our perfect family." This was colder, sharper, like she'd already decided how this night would end and was simply waiting for her cue. My father, Richard, was mid-sentence when she set down her wine glass with a soft clink that somehow sliced through the room. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. My brother, David, leaned back in his chair with that smugness he'd been practicing since childhood, like he'd been handed the script days ago and couldn't wait for the punchline. My sister-in-law, Candace, shifted beside him, shoulders stiff, eyes flicking between faces like she was counting exits. My Aunt Patricia stared down at her mashed potatoes, jaw clenched, as if silence could keep her safe. My mother folded her hands on the table and looked directly at me. With chilling precision, she said, "You're dead to us, Avery." The words didn't land like a slap. They landed like a verdict. For one stupid, disoriented heartbeat, I wondered if I'd misheard, if the clink of glass had rung inside my skull and distorted her voice. But then I looked at my father, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on his plate like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen, and I felt that familiar, hollow certainty. This wasn't an accident. This was planned. No one spoke, not Candace, not Aunt Patricia. No one defended me. No one even pretended to be shocked. And the strangest thing happened. My heart hammered, yes, but underneath it, something cleared. Like fog rolling off a coastline, revealing the rocks you've been ignoring. I took a slow breath, set my napkin beside my untouched plate, met my mother's gaze without flinching. "Understood," I said. One word. That was all I gave them. Then I stood, reached for my coat in the hallway, and walked out of the house I'd spent 28 years trying to belong in, without crying, without bargaining, without looking back. The November air bit at my face as I crossed the driveway. Behind me, the front door opened. "Avery, wait." David's voice, barely loud enough to reach me, as if even his concern needed to be tasteful. I didn't turn around. I slid into my old Honda Civic, hands steady on the wheel, and drove away from the only family I'd ever known. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted, was that a few months later, those same people would show up at my door in the middle of a brutal February snowstorm, desperate, broken, begging. And I would remind them of the words they spoke so easily over dinner. But that night was the culmination, not the beginning. Because I was 7 years old the first time I understood I was invisible. It was David's 9th birthday party, one of those elaborate productions my mother loved. Color-coordinated balloons, a magician, a rented bounce house, half of Fairfield County crammed into our backyard like my brother had been elected into something important. Camera flashes popped like fireworks while David ripped open gifts, laughing as if the world existed solely to applaud him. My mother's laugh was bright and loud, the kind she saved for an audience. My father's hand rested on David's shoulder like a stamp of approval. I remember standing by the dessert table in my Sunday dress, staring at the cake, 2 tiers, glossy icing, David's name piped in perfect blue script. I tugged on my mother's sleeve. "Can I have some cake?" Without looking down, she brushed me off. "Not now, Avery. This is David's day." That became the pattern of my childhood. David's soccer games, David's honor roll certificates, David's acceptance letter to Cornell, celebrated like national holidays. And me? I learned to become smaller, quieter, less of an inconvenience. My mother, Diane, ran our household like a Fortune 500 CEO. Everything scheduled, optimized, designed for maximum social approval. She chaired gala committees, hosted brunches with women who smiled too wide and judged too quietly, and she perfected the art of humble bragging while pretending she was just so tired from being amazing. She didn't want children. She wanted reflections. David understood the assignment. Straight A's, Varsity lacrosse, student council, the kind of charm that made adults lean in and say, "What a wonderful boy." I didn't. I came home with paint under my fingernails instead of trophies. I spent hours sketching trees and clouds in the backyard, while David practiced speeches meant to impress people who already loved him. I asked questions at dinner that made my mother's smile tighten. Why do we invite the Hendersons if you talk badly about them the second they leave? My mother called me difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. My father was worse in a quieter way because he wasn't openly cruel. He was just absent, present in body, vacant in spirit. He nodded when my mother spoke, signed checks, played golf on Saturdays, and treated parenting like a partnership where my mother handled operations and he handled money. And money, in our house, was always spoken about like weather. Something inevitable, something controlled, something that couldn't possibly turn on you. When I was 16, I told them I wanted to study art at Rhode Island School of Design. My mother actually laughed, like I'd told a joke at my own expense. "That's not a career, Avery, that's a hobby. You'll end up waiting tables." My father barely glanced up from his Wall Street Journal. Business administration. Pre-law, maybe. So I compromised, the way I always did. I got a degree in graphic design from Syracuse, practical enough that they stopped lecturing me. Not prestigious enough for them to brag without editing the story. After graduation, I moved to Portland, Maine, into a small apartment above a coffee shop. I freelanced. I built a modest, stable life that was mine. And still, I tried. I called every Sunday, sent thoughtful birthday gifts, drove 6 hours back to Connecticut for every holiday, hoping that maybe this time would be different, hoping they'd see me. They never did. But I kept showing up anyway, until the day everything changed. And the night my mother said, "You're dead to us," wasn't the moment she killed something in me. It was the moment she accidentally set me free. I used to think invisibility was a childhood phase, something you grew out of the way you grew out of scraped knees and Halloween costumes. But invisibility doesn't disappear when you're raised in it. It just changes shape. After David's 9th birthday, I stopped tugging on my mother's sleeve. I stopped asking for things in front of guests. I stopped expecting anyone to notice when I was hungry, bored, sad, or quietly proud of myself. Instead, I learned the rules. Rule 1, don't outshine David. Rule 2, don't embarrass my mother. Rule 3, if you do either of those things, apologize first, even if you don't understand what you're apologizing for. At school, teachers would compliment my drawings, sketches in the margins of notebooks, charcoal portraits I hid in my desk like contraband. I'd bring home an art project I'd poured myself into, hoping for some flicker of interest, some recognition. My mother would glance at it like it was clutter. "That's nice," she'd say, the way people say "that's nice" about a stranger's dog. Then David would walk in with a trophy or a certificate, and the house would shift, like someone had turned on brighter lighting. "Oh my God, David," my mother would sing out, already reaching for her phone. "Let me take a picture. Smile, sweetheart. Richard, come see this." My father would appear like a man answering a meeting request, clap David on the shoulder, and nod as if David's achievements were proof of something he'd invested in wisely. I watched it all from doorways and corners, a silent observer in my own life. What makes it worse, what still makes my throat tighten when I think about it, is that my mother wasn't only cold to me when we were alone. She was cold to me in public too. At the Riverside Country Club, she'd introduce David like a prize she'd won. "And this is David," she'd beam. "Cornell-bound, lacrosse captain, student council. We're just so proud." Then her eyes would flick to me like she'd remembered an extra item on a grocery list. "And this is Avery," she'd add, voice suddenly flatter. "She likes art." Likes art. As if it was a phase, as if it were a weird preference, like eating olives straight from the jar. I learned how to smile through it, how to laugh lightly when her friends made comments like, "Well, we all have one creative one, don't we?" How to swallow the hot humiliation and pretend it didn't matter. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stare at the ceiling in my bedroom and try to figure out what was wrong with me. Because when you're a child, you don't assume your parents are failing you. You assume you are failing them. David didn't have to work for their love. It fell on him like sunlight. He could do the bare minimum and still get praise for breathing in the right direction. I could do everything right and still be met with a sigh. When I was 13, I got straight A's for the first time. I placed the report card on the kitchen counter like an offering. My mother barely looked up from her laptop. "Good," she said. "That's what you're supposed to do." Then, without pause, she asked, "Did you remind David about his dentist appointment?" My father didn't even look at the report card. He was on the phone, voice low and confident, talking about portfolios and returns and someone's aggressive strategy, like the world was an equation he could always solve. There were rare nights my mother would snap at David, usually when he embarrassed her in front of someone important. Those were the only times I saw her anger. But even then, it was different from the anger she aimed at me. With David, it was disappointment. With me, it was contempt. When I was 16 and told them about Rhode Island School of Design, the way she laughed still burns in my memory. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a real laugh, head thrown back, as if I'd announced I wanted to become an astronaut living on glitter. "That's adorable," she said when she recovered, "but we're not paying for that." My father folded his newspaper. "Art school is risky." Risky, like I was a bad investment. So I made another compromise, another quiet surrender. Syracuse, graphic design. Practical enough to sound respectable, creative enough to keep me from suffocating. I left Connecticut the minute I could. Portland, Maine wasn't glamorous. It was small and coastal and smelled like coffee and salt. My first apartment was above a coffee shop, and I could hear the espresso machine screaming every morning through the floorboards. But it was mine. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was living inside someone else's expectations. I freelanced at first. Logos, brochures, website layouts, whatever paid. I learned how to negotiate contracts, how to chase invoices without sounding desperate, how to make stability out of unpredictability. I bought groceries without asking permission. I went to bed without bracing myself for criticism. And still, because hope is stubborn, I kept trying with my family. Every Sunday call felt like auditioning. "Hi, Mom, how are you?" "Busy," she'd say. "We have the gala committee meeting. David has a fundraiser. Your father has a client dinner." "How's David?" "Wonderful," she'd say, bright again. "He's doing so well. He's really making something of himself." "And me?" I'd want to ask. But I never did. I sent gifts, thoughtful ones, the kind I picked with care, scarves in her favorite colors, books I thought she might like, small things that said, "I see you." She rarely thanked me. When she did, it sounded like a formality. Then there was my grandmother, Dorothy Chambers, my father's mother. If my mother treated children like accessories, Grandma Dorothy treated me like a person. She lived in a house on the coast in Unquit, Maine, at 17 Cass Lane, where the windows were always a little salty from ocean spray. The first time she took me there, I was 8 and small enough to fit under her arm without thinking. She led me into the sunroom at the back of the house. The room was flooded with light, the kind of light that made dust look like glitter. Paintings leaned against the walls, seascapes, storm skies, lighthouses in fog. The whole place smelled like oil paint and linseed and something comforting I couldn't name yet. "You can paint in here anytime you want," she told me, like she was giving me a key to a secret world. My mother hated that room. She called it messy, cluttered. "A waste of space," she once muttered, as if art offended her. But Grandma Dorothy smiled at me over her palette and said, "You've got something special, sweetheart. Don't let anyone dim that light." She taught me how to mix colors properly, how to see shadows inside white, how to layer paint so the ocean looked like it was moving. She taught me that art wasn't frivolous. It was essential, a way of noticing what other people missed. When I got older, she was the only person who asked me questions and actually waited for the answer. "How are you really doing, Avery?" Not "how are your grades?" Not "what are you doing next?" "How are you?" When I moved to Portland after college, Grandma Dorothy was the one who sent me a handwritten letter with a $20 bill tucked inside, like I was still 8. "For a good meal," she wrote, "and for paint if you need it." I kept that letter in my desk for years. So when she got sick, I didn't hesitate. I drove down every weekend to sit with her. I brought soup from her favorite deli. I read to her when her eyes got tired. I held her hand while she slept, feeling the papery warmth of her skin and wondering how someone could be so strong and still fade. My mother visited twice in 6 months. Both times she complained about the drive, about the smell of the nursing home, about how depressing it all was. As if my grandmother's illness was an inconvenience. Grandma Dorothy died on a Tuesday in March. She was 84, sharp as a tack until the end. Even in her last weeks, she'd squeeze my fingers and whisper, "Promise me you'll keep making beauty, Avery. Promise." At the funeral, my mother wore black Prada and cried elegantly into a monogrammed handkerchief, the kind of controlled grief that photographed well. David gave a speech about family legacy that sounded like he'd written it in the car. My father shook hands with a lawyer like it was a networking event. I stood there feeling hollow, but also braced, because grief wasn't the only thing waiting for me. 3 days later, we gathered in a lawyer's office for the reading of the will. I sat in the back, expecting nothing. I truly did. In my family, nothing valuable ever landed in my hands. But when the lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Sharon, adjusted her glasses and began reading, the world shifted. To my granddaughter Avery, she said, I leave my home at 17 Cass Lane, Aunquit, Maine, along with all its contents, in the hope that she will continue to create beauty in a world that needs it desperately. The room went silent. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from grief, but from something deeper, a recognition, a final act of love so clear it almost hurt. David spoke first, voice sharp. That's the coastal property, the one worth almost $1 million. Sharon nodded. According to the most recent appraisal, yes. My mother's face hardened instantly, as if tenderness was a weakness she refused to show. There must be some mistake, she said. Sharon didn't flinch. No mistake, Mrs. Chambers. The will is very clear. I barely heard the rest, because all I could see was the sunroom, the easel, the light, the windows rattling softly when the wind came in off the water. And for the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. They were going to come for it. The parking lot outside the lawyer's office was almost empty when the reading ended. Most people left quickly, murmuring polite condolences, the way you do when grief has an expiration date and you're ready to get back to your real life. I lingered by my car, keys clenched in my fist, breathing through the strange mix of gratitude and dread twisting in my chest. I should have known better than to think it would end quietly. Avery. My mother's voice cut through the air, sharp and controlled. I turned to see her striding toward me, heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks. My father followed a few steps behind, hands shoved into his coat pockets. David trailed them, jaw tight, eyes already accusing. You need to sell that house, my mother said without preamble. I blinked. What? The house, she repeated as if I were slow. Your grandmother's house. You need to sell it and split the money with David. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. Grandma left it to me. That doesn't matter, she snapped. It's a family asset. David scoffed softly. It's prime coastal property, Avery. You can't seriously think you're entitled to all of that. Entitled. The word landed exactly where she meant it to, right on top of every old accusation. She wanted me to have it, I said, my voice quieter than I expected. She was very clear. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice into that dangerous, measured tone she used when she was trying not to lose control. You've always been selfish, she said. Always thought you were special because Dorothy indulged your little hobby. My father shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. That house belongs with us, my mother continued. It represents family legacy. It shouldn't be wasted on... Her gaze flicked over me like a judgment. On isolation. Something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just cleanly. For 28 years, I said, my hands trembling now, I have absorbed every criticism you've thrown at me. I've apologized for taking up space. I've tried to earn love that was never going to be freely given. My mother's eyes flashed. How dare you speak to me like that? I'm keeping the house, I said. The words felt foreign in my mouth, solid, unmovable. David laughed, sharp and dismissive. You can't afford it. You're a freelancer. Property taxes alone. I'm managing, I cut in. My mother turned to my father. Richard, say something. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally muttered, You're being unreasonable, Avery. There it was. Not cruelty, not defense. Just avoidance. That hurt more than anything else. I'm leaving, I said, already backing toward my car. Behind me, I heard my mother hiss. She's cut off completely. I'm done with her. I didn't look back. 3 weeks later, I packed up my apartment in Portland and moved into Grandma Dorothy's house. The first night I slept there, the ocean wind rattled the windows like a heartbeat. I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, half expecting someone to burst in and tell me I didn't belong. No one did. In the mornings, light flooded the sunroom exactly the way I remembered. I set up my easel where Grandma's used to stand, the floor still faintly stained with paint from decades of creation. I painted until my shoulders ached, until my mind finally went quiet. For the first time in my life, I stopped waiting for permission. 8 months passed. 8 months of silence from my family. No calls, no messages, No passive-aggressive holiday cards. It should have hurt more than it did. Instead, the absence felt like relief, a pressure released so slowly, I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath. I threw myself into work. I took commissions, custom seascapes, portraits, gallery submissions. I learned how to price my time without apologizing. I learned that people who valued my work didn't need convincing. The house became a sanctuary. White walls, ocean views, the smell of salt and oil paint. Grandma Dorothy's crocheted blankets draped over the couch like quiet blessings. And then there was Ethan. I met him at the local farmer's market one Saturday morning while arguing with myself over whether I really needed fresh bread. He was selling handmade cutting boards from a stall near the apple crates, broad-shouldered, paint-splattered, quietly focused. When I picked one up, he said, "That one's maple, holds up well." Something about his voice, steady, unassuming, made me smile. We started talking about wood grain, about storms, about nothing and everything. He didn't ask what my parents did for a living or where I went to school. He asked what I liked to paint. When I told him about my family, weeks later, sitting on my porch with the ocean roaring below us, he shook his head slowly. "They don't deserve you," he said. I laughed then, but part of me tucked the words away. Because even with the peace I'd found, there was still a small, stubborn hope I couldn't quite kill. That hope arrived in November, in the form of a cream-colored envelope. My mother's handwriting was perfect, as always. "You're invited to Thanksgiving dinner at the Chambers residence. November 23rd, 3:15 p.m. We hope you'll join us." No apology. No acknowledgement of the 8 months of silence. Just a summons. Ethan read it over my shoulder. "You're not seriously considering this." "I don't know," I said. "Maybe they want to make things right." He set down his coffee mug slowly. "Avery, they cut you off because you kept something your grandmother left you. They didn't call when you moved. They didn't ask how you were doing." "I know," I said. I need closure." He squeezed my hand. "Then go, but don't expect them to be different." The drive from Aunquit to Greenwich felt longer than it was. The coastal towns gave way to manicured suburbs, bare trees lining streets with names like Sterling Ridge and Whitmore Court. My parents' house looked exactly the same. Colonial. Black shutters. Lawn trimmed within an inch of its life. A wreath already hung on the door like a performance waiting to begin. I sat in the driveway for a full minute, breathing. Then I rang the doorbell. My mother answered, wearing a cashmere sweater and pearls. "Avery," she said, smiling tightly, "you made it. Not I'm glad you came, not I've missed you." Just a statement of fact. Inside, everything smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and expensive candles. David was already there with Candace, both dressed like they were attending a business dinner. My father stood by the fireplace, bourbon in hand, looking older than I remembered. We made small talk for 20 minutes. Weather, traffic, nothing real. Then we sat down. The table was immaculate. Fine china, crystal glasses, a centerpiece of white roses and eucalyptus. My mother had gone all out, as usual. David poured himself wine and leaned back in his chair. "So, Avery," he said casually, "still living in Grandma's beach house?" The way he said it, Grandma's, made my jaw tighten. "I am." My mother set down her serving spoon with a soft clink. We were actually hoping to discuss that. There it was. The real reason I'd been invited. "The house," Dad said, tone businesslike. "Property values have gone up significantly. If you sold now—" "I'm not selling," I said. David laughed. "You can't live there forever." "I'm managing just fine." My mother smiled thinly. "We're only thinking of what's best for you, sweetheart. That house is too much for one person. And frankly, it's selfish to keep it all to yourself." Selfish. Again. Something settled inside me. They hadn't invited me to reconcile. They'd invited me to pressure me. I looked at my father. "Do you have anything to say?" He stared at his plate, jaw working. Finally, he muttered, "You've embarrassed this family long enough, Avery." My mother straightened. When she spoke, her voice was calm, final. "You're dead to us." Silence fell. I waited for someone to object, to soften it. No one did. So I stood, folded my napkin, set it beside my untouched plate. "Understood," I said. And I walked out. The rain started somewhere around Hartford. At first, it was a mist, the kind that barely registers, the windshield wipers squeaking in lazy protest. By the time I crossed into Maine, it had turned into a downpour. Sheets of water blurring the road, the world narrowing to headlights and white lines. I should have been crying. That's what people expect in moments like that. Sobs, shaking hands, a breakdown pulled over on the shoulder of the highway. For years, I'd imagined this exact scene, always assuming it would destroy me. Instead, I felt lighter, not happy, not relieved, just unburdened, like something I'd been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. I pulled into a rest stop just north of the New Hampshire border and sat in the dark with the engine idling, rain drumming against the roof. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and let myself think the thought I'd never allowed before. They've finally given me permission to stop trying. When I got back to Cass Lane, the house was dark except for the small lamp I'd left on in the living room. I kicked off my shoes, hung my coat, and stood there listening to the ocean pounding below the cliffs. The sound felt steady, constant, unimpressed by human drama. I blocked my parents' numbers that night. I left the family group chat without announcing it. I unfriended them on social media, not out of spite, but because I was done letting their lives intrude on mine like background noise. It wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. Ethan came over the next morning with coffee and fresh bread, took one look at my face, and set everything down. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "They told me I was dead to them." His eyes widened. "Jesus, Avery." "It's okay," I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. "I'm free." He didn't argue. He just wrapped his arms around me, solid and warm, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself to earn the comfort. The weeks that followed were strangely peaceful. Without the constant tension of waiting for the next judgment, I worked better. I painted longer. I slept deeper. The sunroom filled with canvases, storms rolling in over dark water, lighthouses half lost in fog, waves crashing against rock with unapologetic force. People started noticing. A gallery owner in Portland reached out after seeing my work online. A commission turned into two. Two turned into a waiting list. I learned to say no without apologizing when my schedule was full. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself bracing for a call that never came. The silence was doing something to me. It was healing me. And then, 3 months later, winter arrived like a reckoning. February in Maine doesn't creep in. It announces itself. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that swallowed sound and light. The world narrowed to white and gray, the ocean a dark, restless presence beyond the windows. I was in the studio that evening, working on a commission for a Boston gallery, a seascape with storm clouds gathering low over jagged rocks, the kind of sky that promised violence and beauty in equal measure. That's when someone started pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding. Urgent, desperate, the kind of sound that makes your body tense before your mind catches up. I froze, brush hovering midair. The pounding came again, harder this time. I wiped my hands on my paint-stained jeans and walked slowly toward the front door, heart hammering. Through the peephole, I saw two figures huddled on the porch, shoulders hunched against the cold. My breath caught. My parents. But they looked nothing like the people who had sat at that Thanksgiving table. My mother's hair was plastered to her face, mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. Her coat was soaked through, expensive fabric ruined by sleet and snow. My father stood beside her, shoulders sagging, his hands bare and red from the cold. They looked small. For a long moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home, letting them stand there in the snow until they gave up and left. But curiosity, or maybe the last, dying echo of who I used to be, made me unlock the door and open it just a crack. "Avery," my mother said, voice breaking, "please, we need to talk." I said nothing. My father stepped forward, and for the first time in my life, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not irritation, not disappointment. Fear. "We lost everything," he said, words tumbling out like they'd been rehearsed and forgotten all at once. "The house, the investments, it's all gone." I stared at him, the world tilting slightly. "What are you talking about?" My mother's hands were shaking. "Your father's business partner. He was running a scheme, embezzling. The SEC seized the accounts, the properties, everything." The words didn't make sense at first. My father had been a financial advisor for 30 years. Conservative, careful, by the book. Money, in our house, had always been spoken about like a certainty. "The bank foreclosed 2 weeks ago," he continued. "We've been staying in a motel, but we can't afford it anymore." Snow piled on their shoulders as they stood there, melting into their coats, into their hair. "We have nowhere to go," my mother whispered. "Please, Avery, just for a little while, until we get back on our feet." I looked at them, really looked at them, and what I saw weren't my parents. They were strangers who happened to share my face, My history, my DNA. People I'd spent 28 years trying to please, trying to impress, trying to love enough that they might love me back. Every memory came rushing in. Every dismissal. Every comparison. Every time they chose David over me without hesitation. Every holiday where I drove hours hoping for crumbs of affection. And then Thanksgiving. You're dead to us. I took a slow breath. 3 months ago, I said quietly, you told me I was dead to you. My mother's face crumpled. We were angry. We didn't mean... You did mean it, I said. You've meant it my whole life. You just finally said it out loud. My father's voice rose, desperate. We're your parents. You can't just turn your back on us. I almost laughed. That's exactly what you did to me, I said, over and over again. My mother reached out, her hand hovering in the cold space between us. Please, sweetheart. I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet, settled certainty. I met her eyes and said the words I'd been carrying since November. The dead don't come back. Then I stepped back and closed the door. I turned the lock, drew the curtain. Behind the door, I heard her voice break, muffled by wood and winter. Avery, please. I walked back to the studio, picked up my brush, and returned to my painting. The pounding continued for another minute. Then it stopped. Through the window, I watched them walk back to a beat-up Ford sedan I didn't recognize, nothing like the Mercedes they used to drive. They sat there for a long time, talking, maybe crying. Eventually, they drove away. The taillights disappeared into the snow. I waited for guilt, for regret, for that old voice that had spent my entire life telling me I owed them something because they were my parents. It never came. Instead, I felt peace. Deep, unshakable. The house was impossibly quiet after they left. Not the hollow, echoing quiet that feels like abandonment, but a settled one. Like the kind of silence that comes after a storm has burned itself out, leaving the air clearer than before. I stood at the window long after their taillights disappeared, watching snow drift sideways in the wind. The ocean below roared steadily, indifferent, ancient. It had seen worse endings than mine. It had also seen beginnings. I kept waiting for the guilt to arrive, for the familiar weight in my chest, the inner voice that had governed me since childhood, the one that whispered, "You're ungrateful, you owe them, they're your parents." But it never came. Instead, I felt something I'd spent most of my life chasing without knowing its name. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on other people behaving better, not the conditional kind that shatters the moment someone disapproves of you. This was solid, quiet, mine. I made tea and sat on the couch, wrapped in one of Grandma Dorothy's crocheted blankets, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The house smelled like smoke and salt and paint. It smelled like home. My phone buzzed. Ethan. Hey, you okay? Want me to come over? I stared at the message for a long moment, surprised by how steady my hands were. I'm okay, I typed back. Actually, I'm better than okay. I'll call you tomorrow. A few seconds passed. I love you, he replied. I smiled softly. Love you too. I set the phone aside and watched the flames dance, thinking about how strange it was that people equated forgiveness with access, as if letting someone back into your life was the only proof of growth, as if boundaries were cruelty. What I'd learned, what it had taken me nearly 3 decades to understand, was that forgiveness didn't mean reopening wounds. Sometimes it meant closing the door gently and walking away without hatred. My parents had built their lives on control, perfection, and conditional love. They raised children the way they manage portfolios, rewarding performance, punishing deviation, always calculating returns. When I didn't deliver the version of myself they wanted, I became disposable. That wasn't my failure. That was theirs. Over the next few weeks, the world kept turning, quietly, steadily, as if nothing monumental had happened. I painted, I answered emails, I walked the beach in the early mornings, cold air burning my lungs in the best way. Aunt Patricia called once. She apologized for not speaking up at Thanksgiving, her voice tight with regret. She told me my parents had moved in with David and Candace. It's tense, she admitted carefully. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not sympathy. They were characters in a story I was no longer living. Spring came slowly, prying winter's grip loose, inch by inch. And with it came an email from the Portland gallery owner who'd been following my work. They wanted a solo show. 15 paintings, all inspired by the coast. I hung up the phone after confirming dates and just stood there, stunned, the ocean wind rattling the windows like applause. Grandma Dorothy had once told me success didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just shows up quietly and stays. The night of the opening, the gallery sold out. Every piece. People stood in front of my paintings and talked about movement and light and emotion. Strangers told me my work made them feel seen. A woman cried in front of one of my storm canvases and thanked me for painting something she couldn't put into words. Ethan stood in the corner watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pride, yes, but also certainty. Like he'd always known this was coming. A week later, he took me to the beach at Cass Lane, the same stretch of rocks where Grandma Dorothy used to set up her easel. The sky was clear, the water restless but calm enough to approach. He didn't make a speech. He didn't need to. He just knelt in the sand, held out a simple ring, and said, "Will you build a life with me?" I said yes without hesitation. We were married that summer in the backyard of the house at Cass Lane. No country club, no curated guest list, no performative perfection. Just people who loved us. Ethan's family, my friends. Natalie officiated, laughing through half the ceremony. We served lobster rolls and champagne. Someone played guitar as the sun dipped low over the water, turning the sky gold and pink. It wasn't magazine perfect. It was real. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Ethan and I sat on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets, stars scattered overhead. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. I thought about my parents, about David, about the little girl who'd stood by a dessert table waiting for permission to matter. "No," I said, "not one." He kissed my forehead. "Good." Because when my parents told me I was dead to them, they thought it would break me. They thought I'd come crawling back, apologizing for existing. They were wrong. That night in the snow, when I closed the door, I wasn't being cruel. I was choosing myself. Finally. Completely. Without apology. And in doing so, I didn't end a relationship. I began a life.